Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Today, we'll have a webinar on listening to and learning from nonprofit partners during disasters. Commit to listening to our partners and lifting up their voices and experiences to inform public discourse. Wonderful. Now I'm going to pass it on to our moderator this afternoon, Grace. Grace?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on listening to nonprofit partners in a time of crisis. My name is Grace Nicolette, Vice President of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. This webinar is a joint effort between CEP and the Council on Foundations. I want to especially thank the Council for making this webinar possible, especially Kathleen, Natalie, Manuela, Daniela, Tara, and Brian. Kathleen can no longer join us today, so I'm standing in for her. We're so grateful for the Council's vital work and our partnership together. Thanks to the Council, many of you know, more than 600 funders have signed on to an important pledge. It says that funders, and I'll quote here, commit to listening to our partners and especially to those communities least heard, lifting up their voices and experiences to inform public discourse and our own decision-making so we can act on their feedback. We recognize that the best solutions to the manifold crises caused by COVID-19 are not found within foundations. Many funders, as a result, want to know how to best support their nonprofit partners during this time without adding extra burdens to organizations who are facing the brunt of this COVID crisis. We know that listening to those you hope to serve is an important practice at all times because it enables grant makers to make better decisions. COVID-19 certainly has added a degree of great difficulty to most parts of our daily lives and to our work. One tension that many grant makers are currently balancing is a desire to deeply understand how they can be maximally helpful to nonprofits and communities, while also respecting the extraordinary pressures that they face, especially on their time. These dynamics are driving many funders to seek feedback and input differently in this moment. The Council and CEP have assembled this esteemed group of panelists to share what they're learning and doing differently, to listen to the communities that are least heard, to amplify their voices and consider their views in their decision-making. Our hope for this time is that you'll better understand what nonprofits need generally, perhaps beyond just funding, and how you can best approach seeking feedback in a time of crisis. You'll hear some practical advice and guidance for operationalizing a culture of listening and learning in the complex environment that we are in now. You'll also find out more about approaches to hearing from those least heard and centering those most affected by the COVID crisis. So now I'd like to introduce everyone to our panelists today. First, we're so pleased to have Pancho Guevara on the call. He's a nonprofit leader who can talk frankly about what's working and what's not is helpful in the approaches he's seen from funders. Pancho is the executive director of San Jose, California's Sacred Heart Community Service, which envisions a community united to ensure that every child and adult is free from poverty. Pancho is also a grantee of the Fund for Shared Insights Listen for Good initiative. Next, Faye Twersky is the co-chair of the Fund for Shared Insight and vice president at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, where she manages special initiatives to improve the foundation's grant making and other special projects. Faye also leads the foundation's Effective Philanthropy Group, which supports a strong philanthropic sector. My colleague Kevin Boldick is also with us. Kevin is the Vice President of Assessment and Advisory Services at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and he leads the creation and delivery of CEP's performance assessments, including the Grantee Perception Report, an approach that more than 300 funders now have used to listen to grantees, providing them with candid feedback and advice. Next, Dennis Quirin leads the Raikes Foundation in Seattle, which supports education, impact-driven philanthropy, and youth homelessness. And he previously served as the president of the Neighborhood Funders Group. Last but not least, we have Valerie Threlfall. She's a principal of Equite Consulting and managing director of Listen for Good, which is an initiative of Fund for Shared Insight. It's designed to help nonprofits build sustainable, high-quality, client-focused feedback loops that lead to meaningful change. More than 450 organizations have used it thus far. So Because we have so many important voices on the webinar today, I want to make sure we get to everyone. There's a lot of wisdom here to be shared. I'd like to ask our panelists that we keep our initial responses to my questions to under 3 minutes. And I really hope this time can be interactive. You can ask each other questions, and many of the attendees on this call have submitted questions as well, which we've incorporated already. And if you haven't submitted a question, I do encourage you to do so, and we'll be doing our best to get to them. So, I'd like to start today with Pancho. Pancho, given that the focus of this call is how to best hear from and center the voices of nonprofits and communities, I really wanted to hear from you first. Could you share a bit about what your personal experience has been with your funders during COVID-19? And in particular, what do you think foundations need to know about how to listen well?
Thank you, Grace. I just want to set the scene really briefly. Sacred Heart Community Service is based in downtown San Jose. And starting at the beginning of March, we started to see things starting to change very quickly. And our public health department, which has been out front on this, has been in regular communication with us. So we started to see people feeling some of the effects of this, being displaced from their employment and other things right away. And it was disrupting our operations because volunteers that we rely upon to serve the 60 some odd thousand folks a year that come to Sacred Heart were starting to drop off, and we were entering into our own version of a crisis. And we were seeing families that we hadn't seen in some time that hadn't been coming to us for food or financial assistance or other things, showing up and letting us know that this was a different kind of situation. So we were trying to adjust to them. So the experience that we had, at least initially, was reaching out to some of the funders and letting them know, we think that we're seeing something different. This is not just going to be the onset of a temporary kind of event, but we're not sure exactly what that is, and asking them what they knew, and also talking to them about whether or not they're preparing to be able to provide additional resources or have advice and support for us. And so our initial experience was reaching out to some partners, and one of the partners I'll talk about a little bit about today, and maybe a little bit more, was Destination Home, which is embedded within the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Has been our partner on a homelessness prevention system. And we started doing some joint planning and thinking about this, and they were doing some aggressive fundraising to assemble different forms of financing. And their conversation with us was, hey, what are you hearing? What do you need? What are we anticipating? What projection, and how do we want to center the voice of people in that conversation, which we started bringing up in terms of developing a response fund to be able to look at what was happening with families. But also they were instrumental in terms of saying what other places can we reach out to folks, other forms of philanthropy. Do you need technology? Do you need other types of things? And they became their staff became very much embedded with us over this period, and championing the fundraising and getting out ahead of this crisis in a lot of other ways. But the other experiences that we had with philanthropy ran the spectrum. Some cases we'd be reaching out to folks and we'd hear back right away and say, hey, I would reach out and say, hey, can we talk? Let's connect and have some kind of conversation about what was going on, with us. And they were asking questions. Some of them were asking us questions about what was needed, and some I got silence. Didn't get any response back, and other things. So I think that initial response was really telling. But I think the question that you're asking about, what do we need to know about listening well? I think what was really important is to really be in relationship with the organizations like ours, to really know that who are the organizations that are on the ground, really dealing with some of the most, not just the immediate needs, but the critical needs of extremely vulnerable populations. And those that actually knew us well were the ones reaching out and offering things and the second thing is to be flexible and forgiving. We were all underwater, just completely, just like all of your organizations, when people were having to work from home, or folks ended up getting sick, or there ended up being other types of crises. Just like you all, we were reinventing our business model and trying to figure out what was happening. And in some organizations, if you have a larger staff and well suited, you might be able to have the bandwidth and flexibility to do more communications and outreach. Some of us were not. We're coping with all the things that you were dealing with and trying to figure that out. And forgiving. Sometimes they were saying, oh, well, we're happy to help you. Send us a proposal. And some of us don't have the bandwidth to be able to do that very quickly, or sometimes missing deadlines, but just saying, hey, we're going to make it more streamlined, more flexible, and and help walk through this so we can actually make sure that we're hopeful, that we're able to be helpful. Moving quickly was also something really, really important. If you, and be honest, if you're not going to be able to do much of anything because you're dealing with other types of issues, don't waste our time. Just be straight in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. And remember, more than anything I said about flexibility, remember that we're impaired. Our organizations are trying to respond to urgent, dynamic, and overwhelming human needs. And also for those of us that are disconnected from our bases of we do community organizing in addition to basic needs, a lot of our folks are not digitally connected. And so for us to be able to reach out and find out from folks took us a little bit longer, and we weren't able to do so immediately. So those that are serving and saying, what are you hearing from your bases? That's a difficult thing to be able to do, but within some time and with some encouragement, it was really helpful for us to get things moving.
That's great. Thank you so much. Faye, I wanted to bring you in. So you personally and the Hewlett Foundation as an institution have a deep and long-term commitment to effective philanthropy and all that entails, including a really systematic and thoughtful approach to feedback. I'm wondering, what are you noticing and learning about how to adjust approaches to feedback in this reality? And if you have any reflections on what Pancho just shared too about his experience, that would also be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Grace. I would say a few things that we're doing that we're learning from. The first is that we've just gotten approval, and we'll be announcing in the coming days, but it's a little preview, that we're going to be making a $10 million grant to support local relief efforts in the 10 Bay Area counties. And we're doing that through the partnership of the local community foundations and local nonprofits who have deep roots and connections to people and communities on the ground. So more to say about that soon, but one, I think, important lesson for us is that we don't have to do everything ourselves. We don't have to develop new competencies of listening when we have good, effective partners on the ground, community foundations and other community organizations like the one Pancho leads, who can do that kind of listening and responding to their constituents, and we can rely on that kind of listening, and we don't have to repeat that effort. So that's sort of one important lesson that we have learned and are trying to follow through on. We don't have to recreate a wheel. A second is that we have programs that work all over the globe. So each of our programs are listening in ways that are sort of specific and relevant for their fields and contexts and places and cultures around the globe. Probably most of the listeners on this call work domestically. So I thought I would just share a quick story about our Western conservation work, which is in the North American West. And just as context, we have about 85 grantees in that portfolio of work. We aim to preserve the ecosystems, natural habitats in the North American West. About a third of the grantees are national environmental conservation organizations, a third are regional, and a third are quite local, working with tribes and local community organizations that have a close connection to the land. And early on in this process, about mid-March, our program officer in our Western Conservation team sent a note out to all of our grantees in that portfolio saying, how are you doing? Wanting to check in. I know there were about 30 grants that were teed up to go through a renewal process in the next month or so. And the first thing she did was offer reassurance that we're going to make those grants. Don't worry, we're going to stay in touch. And we did, in fact, do that. And then there was follow-up a couple of weeks later, individual to each of the organizations saying, how are you doing? And what's going on? And I see we've had, a first case in Montana, like being quite specific, which took time, but paid back in dividends. The first thing that people often said, and we hear this in Listen for Good too, but the first thing that people said was thank you for asking, for reaching out and asking how we're doing. And of course, like Pancho said, people were at all different places. They were going through crises personally, as well as lots going on inside their organizations. one of the things that happened after that first communication was that people who had different communication styles showed up in different ways. So the introverts wrote long letters saying how they were doing and what was going on personally and professionally, and the extroverts said, "I'm so glad you wrote, and can we talk tomorrow?" and then responding to those different both communication styles, listening to them in the ways that they preferred, and then trying to respond in ways that we could within the bounds. And as Pancho said, being clear about what we could do and also what we couldn't do. One of the things we were able to do was provide a coach to 10 of the organizations that were kind of in crisis, not necessarily financial crisis, but crisis of just trying to figure out how do I make what decisions. And so making an offer that wasn't a requirement from a funder, but just to say, here's an offer. If you would like to have a coach at this time, we offered it to 10 of the organizations. And 9 of them came back and said, yes, we would love that. 1 came back and said, actually, I don't need that. I already have a coach. Offer that to somebody else. And we did. And that coach and that experience has been hugely helpful to those leaders who are in crisis and needed somebody to kind of talk through their decisions with. So lots of lessons there, listening through local partners, early communications, providing reassurance, and doing the communication and listening in a way that was individual and suited for each leader's needs.
Great, thanks so much, Faye. It's great to hear some of those specific examples of how Hewlett has been supporting grantees. I want to bring my colleague Kevin in. So as some of you on the call may know, CEP, we've been a leader for decades now in the field about how best to gather and make changes based on feedback for nonprofits and also beneficiaries. Kevin, I'm wondering if you could share with us, how are you advising CEP's clients in shifting their own thinking during this unprecedented moment? What are you seeing?
Thanks, Grace. And I want to really bring a couple points back to points that Pancho and Faye started with, and to build on the great blog post that if you haven't seen it, you should all read it, that Valerie and Faye and their colleague Melinda Tuan wrote on the CEP blog a few weeks ago. I've really been thinking about listening in kind of 5 specific points. I don't know, I'll get through all of them in this first little intro, but the first one I think really is to emphasize what Pancho said, that listening quickly is really important right now. And I'm grateful for the speed that I can see funders moving at. Just to give an example, there was a group of 5 funders in a rural area in the Northeast that asked us to come together and quickly survey, with a very brief survey, nonprofits in their communities about what nonprofits really needed so they could get rapid, quick feedback from grantees. And what was really interesting in that is that those nonprofits told us that they had heard generally from about 50% of their funders. And this is a few weeks into the crisis, so it's exactly the experience that Pancho was talking about. Only half of funders had reached out to these grantees. And what's important to note is that nearly 20% of them said they had less than a month of operating support, or so that they could not operate for more than a month without a further influx of cash. So if you're not listening rapidly, you're not listening well. And if you haven't heard from every single one of your grantees already as a funder, you're already late. The second thing I'd say, I think, is listen carefully, right? The funder-grantee power dynamic that we all know about exists, and it's only going to be exacerbated by this crisis. Of course, grantees are going to say thank you, to the point that Faye said, and that's important. And it's important not to stop there. No one is suggesting anything else, but you need to push beyond that. And one of the things I've seen a couple funders do recently, which I thought was really helpful, is to share experiences anonymized of their other nonprofits, the crises or the challenges those nonprofits were facing, so that it opened up a difficult conversation in a way that the particular grantee felt invited to share something that might be challenging if they didn't know somebody else was in the same boat. The third thing I'd say is listen differently. Don't assume that the same approaches or questions that you were asking a couple months ago still apply in the same way. And I say this because CEP had thousands of grantee surveys around the world in the field at the moment that COVID really started to hit. And we looked at surveys that were started before COVID hit certain areas and those that were started after COVID hit certain areas. And across those 2 sets of responses, we didn't see differences. And that's good news. Funders were just as responsive, just as impactful, just viewed as just as clear by these grantees. But then when we started looking funder by funder at the responses, we saw big differences. So for some funders, it was really clear that the moment that COVID hit, grantees' perceptions were different. in general, they felt that some of those funders were not understanding them, their challenges, or their beneficiaries very well. And so just make sure the listening you're doing is focused on rechecking assumptions and generating deep understanding. 2 more quick points. I want to emphasize what Faye said about listening comprehensively. It would be so easy to just hear from the people whose voices are loudest, the leaders that are most experienced, the organizations that are best resourced in this moment. It's really imperative that we listen carefully and listen comprehensively. And if that means something like, I'll defend the humble survey for a second, if that means using a quick survey to hear from folks so that you can hear from everybody, do that. But at least make sure that you're tracking who you've heard from so that you can be sure you've heard from everyone. And the final point I want to make, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, is we should just be honest and say that listening is not enough. It is an imperative first step to know who and how to support and who to give to, but it's not enough. Nonprofits need resources right now. And that survey that I mentioned earlier that we did on behalf of 5 funders in this community, we asked them an open-ended question just to write about what they really most needed from funders at this moment. The word listen was not mentioned a single time. What was mentioned again and again and again was funding, resources, general operating support. So listening is necessary to know how and who to help. It's essential, and it's a first step. So at a moment like this, we need to go beyond just listening, but make sure that the actions we're taking are well informed by what we heard. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Moving along, Dennis, I know you're fairly new to your role at Raikes, but you come to that position with deep expertise, especially in equity and centering community voices. And I'm wondering, in your role, how are you integrating these priorities at Raikes, and how does it contribute to your decision-making during this time?
Thank you, Grace. I think I would start by just saying that, you know, there's an acknowledgement that the world has changed. And I don't know that we're going to go back to the way that things were, even when this crisis is over. And in different times, different approaches are required. So I think right now, one of the things I'll start with is it's incredibly important to think about how you're showing up right now as a grant maker and as a person, because our partners are anxious, they're scared, they're hurting, and we need to make sure that we're connecting with them as people first. And the other thing I think that's important in how we're showing up, and it's echoed in my colleagues' comments, you know, a lot of us signed the Council on Foundation Pledge, which I think was a brilliant early start to shifting the conversation. Some foundations are able to double their funding or put out more money. You may not be able to, but I think what we need to commit to as a field is to not cut budgets at all, like hold the line on our expenses. And we may be hurting economically, but it's nothing like what our nonprofit partners are feeling. So I think holding the line, showing up as people, and connecting with people is the place to start. And I think once that baseline level of sort of approach is established, it's important to lean into the trust that you've already built with your partners. So, you know, they're the ones that are on the ground. And this is where trusted networks become incredibly important. They will know much better than you what this immediate response is requiring. So being able to, like my colleagues have said, being able to listen deeply, to be there as a partner with your trusted partners is an incredibly essential place to start. We've done that here at the Raikes Foundation. Through that basic approach, we've been able to launch a fund in support of homeless youth. You know, with school closures, homeless students and youth are going to be hurting a lot. Schools are a lifeline for them. And because of our trusted relationships with organizations like Building Changes, we've been able to understand the best way to approach that. We've brought in young people as a focus group, and we've paid them for their time. They've improved the fund greatly in how it should be targeted. And this would have not been possible if we didn't have those relationships already. So I think start with your trusted partners. But I think from that point, it's important to reach out beyond the places that you're comfortable. I think, Kevin, you were talking about this as well. We all know that some organizations are going to be far more comfortable and able to reach out and ask for support and funding. And it is our job to look around the corner right now. There are a lot of pooled funds that are getting launched. Take a look, if you're a local funder, take a look at which communities are not being covered. and do your own legwork to find out how you might be able to support those community organizations and other organizations who may be essential lifelines for their neighborhoods or their communities. I think it's essential for us to take on that responsibility to try to reach beyond our trusted partners and to balance that with our trusted partners. This is absolutely a moment to break out of our silos. It is a moment to break out of the way that we've always done things. On my staff, we've talked a lot about experimentations. I think it's just important to follow the lead of those that are in the field, follow your instincts, try things differently, because we're in a highly adaptive moment. So the next point I would make is that the immediate response is essential, and it's important for us to be able to look around the advocacy corner as well. So given that these times have changed drastically, and it's highlighted holes in our public systems, our safety nets, it's highlighted communities that are once again being completely left out of stimulus packages and other types of support. I think it's important for all of us as funders to begin to think about what are the types of organizations that we can support who are looking around the corner, who are preparing for the midterm impacts of this crisis. For us in Washington State, there's a very large immigrant community that work as farm workers, work in in agriculture in different ways, and they are frontline workers doing essential work on our food system. They are underprotected, and so we've made a grant to One America to do advocacy around those communities with the hope of more resources showing up in future stimulus packages. Finally, I think the last point I want to make is in our listening to organizations, I think one of the big things that we've been hearing is fatigue. And it's fatigue in all the ways that you would expect. Existential fatigue in this moment, feeling the limits of what you're able to do. And so much of this points to the fact that for decades we have been underfunding our public systems. And I think we're in this moment now where whether or not you're a democracy funder, whether or not you think about voting and protecting the vote and expanding the vote, I think it's essential that we all take a look at what can we do to lean into our public systems and protecting our democracy. So I would say, in the spirit of looking around the corner and in the spirit of advocacy, we should be really thinking about what else we might be able to do there. And with that, I'll pause these initial remarks.
Thank you. And finally, I wanted to invite Valerie to speak. So Valerie, you're one of the co-authors of the recent blog post that Kevin mentioned on CEP's blog. Again, I encourage you all to take a look at that. And your career has really been devoted to feedback. So can you share some fundamentals as well as some examples for funders and how they can get started on this process if this is not something they've been doing systematically up until now?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. So I think we've talked today a lot about the whys of feedback, and those are definitely important. And even I think we're all aligned as we even start to highlight some of the key principles. But I guess I'd like to focus a bit on some of the hows, because in my experience, both with Listen for Good and other work, really nailing the hows is critical if you want meaningful change to come out of your listening efforts. And so from our piece, I think I'd highlight three main takeaways for funders as they're embarking on listening. First is to think about the fact that feedback loops really form the backbone of a strong listening program. And so I encourage funders to stay focused on the principles of feedback. And what do I mean by that? So at Listen for Good, and we've broken listening down into a simple, continuous feedback loop process where you focus on sort of the simple steps of design, like figuring out what you want to learn, collecting, analyzing and making sense, responding to feedback though, and finally, fifth, closing the loop, which is a step in terms of sharing back with the people who gave you input, what you heard and what you're doing about it. And so right now in this moment, I'd encourage people to really be thoughtful about three steps in particular. Design, so being very clear on what you want to know, get super clear on what you want to know. Being sure to respond and actively respond. I think we've heard sort of don't collect feedback and do nothing with it. So really being thoughtful about taking some active response, and finally closing the loop. And while this may sound like a lot, I don't think it's advocating for laborious listening processes. I think now it's about finding things that are very nimble, as folks have indicated, some of my colleagues have indicated, that don't take up a lot of grantee time. A second takeaway, and I think are, again, consistent with some of the points that Dennis and Kevin and others made, is really focusing on accessibility. So not just in how you ask for input, but who you ask. So it goes without saying, and we've highlighted that nonprofits are very overburdened right now. So I think providing multiple paths for people to share feedback, especially low lift ways to connect. Like Kevin, I do love surveys. Listen for Good, it's the heart of what Listen for Good is a survey-based program. But right now, phone calls may be a much easier and more appropriate way to gather input, especially initial input. You may even want to consider setting up sort of voicemail boxes or other more passive ways that at minimum provide people an opportunity to engage on their own time, whether it's grantees or even community members who may not have access to all the technology that you would expect them to have around being able to take a survey and provide input that way. And as Dennis and I think also pointed out, this is a moment to also think about that we're hearing from those whose voices are typically maybe not heard the loudest. So an example that we highlight in the blog is in response to COVID, the Brooklyn Foundation, which is a community foundation with a long history of listening, reached out intentionally and held calls with local groups that served elders, immigrants, and domestic workers. And they did this specifically to get a pulse on how these groups would be impacted by the crisis. To me, this is a great example of what accessibility means, and I think Dennis highlighted similar themes, that it's not just about sort of having your door open, but that you need to be the one to leave the door, go out your door metaphorically and actually engage the community. And as funders take that step, particularly given the power dynamics that are at play. And then I would just finally say to think about this as the start of a conversation and not a one-time listening moment. The focus of listening efforts is going to evolve over time. In many ways, I think of the listening right now as a funnel. And so right now, organizations' most critical objective is to be very broad in their listening efforts. We heard from Pancho and Faye that being asked how you are and connecting and just kind of keeping it broad is so meaningful right now. And that's the mouth of the funnel. But over time, I do think that listening is inevitably going to have to narrow a bit, and just as a funnel does, to prioritization. And organizations and funders are going to be making hard choices about where to put limited resources. And so as you move to crafting responses, it's wise to then to remember you have to go back and pressure test what you're doing to form your strategy before you execute. This is the kind of continuous conversation that I think we need to start to ignite. Just an example, in October 2019, my firm Écoutez wrote a paper on behalf of the Hewlett Foundation looking at foundation listening practices in normal times. And that feels like a lifetime ago to have written something this fall. But one of the things that we heard was that the most fruitful time to listen and engage communities was really during strategy formulation. So of the listening instances that we cataloged across 20 foundations, 66% of the instances of listening were during this phase. And right now we have a ton, and I think Dennis indicated this, we have a ton of strategies that are being developed right now. And so given this, I think it's a critical moment to initiate a conversation, but it has to be one that will continue and that will inform future strategy decisions. Just to close with one quick example, the San Francisco Foundation is someone we cited in our paper, and a few years ago they held a number of voice sessions as part of a development of a racial and economic equity agenda. The sessions that they held were initially really broad and focused on hearing daily struggles and challenges and assets of the community. These were listening sessions with community. But then at the last month of their listening tour, they actually went back and previewed their strategy and said, how do we do? What are we missing? Where did we miss the mark? And that is, I think, a behavior that frankly isn't that typical in how funder strategy is set. And I think it's a great example of an iterative listening process and the kind of processes that would be great to bake in right now for others to emulate. So with that, I'll stop there, but those are some initial thoughts.
Thanks. I think one question that is coming up now that I'm seeing, and I think there's sort of strains in each of the responses you gave, is that this is a very different moment. Funders are called to listen in a different way, perhaps, than they're typically used to. I can also imagine from a funder's perspective that, you know, you entered this year with a set budget and certain priorities, and now all of that is just gone out the window. And there can be a real tension between opening that door to listen and yet perhaps not being able to be the one to meet every need. I'm wondering if particularly Dennis and Faye or anyone could actually speak to what would you advise a foundation that feels like we would like to listen and, you know, we're not the government, our priorities are pretty much set at this point. How can I not give false hope, or how do I listen well if funding is not necessarily part of that equation?
I'll jump in just quickly. I think there are multiple parts to that question. I think one of the big looming aspects of that question is what funds are available if there are new partners that come online. And like, that is a real deal question. I will say, just touching back to my opening remarks, that, you know, our purpose here is to be a financial engine for charity and for change. And our funds are needed now more than they've ever been. Without a doubt. And if there is a time to dip a little deeper and to dig a little deeper into the resources that we have, this is the time. I think, you know, so many questions are being called that are tied to the immediate moment, but are also tied to the health and the sort of the future of our public systems and our ability to protect people and to allow people to thrive. So one aspect of that is what funds are available. I think another aspect is, you know, there is a philanthropic responsibility that we have when we bring on new partners to try to not just jump in and jump out. And I think that is something that is an imperative for folks in philanthropy to really grapple with. And this is the time to experiment. And I think, you know, if you are able to be super clear about what a grant is or isn't, how long it may last or not last from the start, you know, hopefully that can free you up conceptually from the idea of what might it look like to bring on someone who maybe we can't fund in a year or two. You know, some of those questions just sort of need to sort themselves out as time evolves. But I would say be comfortable with experimenting right now. I think that is a really big point. And then the last thing that if you are just unable to make grants to someone, there is so much more that foundations are able to do in support of communities. We are networks, and we're a hub frequently of information, of relationships. And the question is, in what way are you able to be a liberated gatekeeper versus a gatekeeper? If you identify a need and you are not able to meet it for one reason or another, are you able to connect them with someone else who can? Can you use your perch to open a door with a public sector official that you've got a relationship with? Are there other funders that you know of who might be able to support them? Or can you at least just give some advice and be super clear if you're not able to follow through with funding? This isn't something we can do, but here are things that I'm observing. So it's just not being so worried about the wall between philanthropy and the organizations doing the work, and to just show up as a partner and know that you're a part of this as well.
Great, thanks.
I would offer a different perspective, not a different perspective, but something that I think is really important now is like this is a gut check moment. This is where institutions have to determine what are they about and how relevant are they to those that are needed the most. And sometimes it can really clarify who you are and what relevance that you have to communities that are not only the most vulnerable, but what relationships you have with those communities that are essential to be able to address a crisis like this. And so we feel it very clearly in those institutions that are saying, you know what, I'm going to show up for you now. I'm going to listen. I'm going to, provide resources. I'm going to commit to you over the long haul. And I recognize that you are actually not only just responding to these needs, not just a bigger player that's easier to perhaps work with, but that long-term investment in infrastructure, and we're going to be able to go through some pain as well as an institution, like freeing up additional resources for organizations that are on the ground, because we know that the pain that your community is experiencing right now. And it's also an opportunity to really think about power dynamics and how power plays out in that. Are you willing to leverage some of your positional power within your institutions, within policy-making spheres, to be able to say, I need to step forward. I'm going to do so in a listening way. I'm going to listen to what are you hearing right now? What do we need to be pushing policymakers on? And how am I able to be able to do that, and making sure that we're part of that? Because some of us are modestly impaired when we can't bring people to City Hall, and folks can't dial in on a Zoom call or whatever, with that, it becomes way more challenging for you to be able to say, how can I leverage the power that I have, and how do I shut up and listen and advance that and put that on there? Like to go bang on the governor's door and say, why are undocumented folks left out of the equation when it comes to unemployment insurance, or what are we doing about rent relief or moratoriums around that, because our folks are really suffering. Seeing those kind of partners check in with us, we offer some ideas and opportunity. We need your resources, but we need your voice, we need your power, and utilize that and put it on the table right now more than ever.
Thank you. Faye, you were also going to.
Yeah, sure. I guess I would come to the point in my opening remarks about making sure that we are listening in the different contexts that we're in. So for us, our listening and responding looks different in each of the programmatic areas that we're in. So in our climate work, I talked about our Western conservation. I didn't talk about our climate work. Those organizations are fairly stable. Like they're not facing themselves existential threat, but what they are grappling with is trying to inform policymaking right now that's providing relief to companies that are in the business of emitting lots of carbon. So, our grantees need our help in ways that affect the policy and advocacy realm, not necessarily in extra grant making in that field. So that's in that context. But in our global development work, where one of our strategies is about providing evidence to inform policymaking, we are just about to make a grant to inform to 10 think tanks that are doing policy that's quite relevant to COVID response and relief in those 10 countries, to inform their health ministries. So in that case, the listening to those grantees and responding to them with a grant that allows them to do extra research and inform policymaking to get ahead of the epidemic, that's sort of the right kind of listening there. And then, locally, another area of giving for us is the performing arts program in the Bay Area, where we support a large number of the community-based performing arts groups in the Bay Area, and they are devastated. That field is devastated right now because they rely on ticket sales, and there are no ticket sales. And so where you have a month or two of operating reserves but no ticket sales, that is very threatening to the very existence of those organizations. But even extra funding from us to each of them is not going to let them all survive. So then the question is, how do we be thoughtful about supporting the preservation of art? How do we be thoughtful about supporting mergers and organizations working together in ways that they might not have before? So each context and each field requires really listening carefully, sort of as what Valerie was saying, going further into the funnel of what exactly are you saying, what would be helpful that's within the bounds of what we can do and might actually be helpful for the fields and ambitions that we share together.
Great, thank you. One question that's come through is, how can we effectively share what we're learning from grantees with our board to help them understand the severity of the crisis? And anyone can jump in here. Anyone?
I'll start. You know, we are a little bit of a different type of a foundation. We're a private foundation, and the trustees, the founders of the foundation, are very active actually in the programming. So, I mean, for us, there is almost a seamless, you know, information sharing between what happens within the organization at a strategic level and what Jeff and Tricia Raikes are sort of aware with, because they do a lot of their own communications and advocacy work around racial equity and other things. And so, you know, we have the opportunity to think in a more sort of full spectrum way around how our grant making links with their platform. But, you know, it's been a phenomenal asset of the organization that the communication flow sort of up and down the organization is so tight.
That's great. Kevin, I'm wondering, in your engagements with foundations, when there has been that kind of disconnect, what typically do you advise them, the CEOs?
The disconnect between the CEO and the board in terms of
when it comes to like a crisis moment like this.
Yeah, you know, I think the thing that I keep coming back to is that we are all learning in this moment. Boards are too, but let's just stipulate that boards, particularly of funders, are often sitting in positions of privilege and may not be quite as aware of what's happening on the ground as, well, certainly the folks on the ground, and then maybe folks who are on the program teams of foundations. And so to me, what I always come back to is there's not just one kind of information or one kind of response from a staff to a board that's going to make the message stick or make the message clear, and that it's really important to mix both a comprehensive view, what you've learned from others, what you've learned from the research that's already been done on how communities are affected by COVID, and to pair that with the opportunities to hear directly from folks on the ground that boards may not have access to regularly. So, for example, a quote we had that we shared with the staff and boards of the 5 funders who came together to ask us to hear from their grantees quickly in rural New York. And this person, you know, I think summed up nicely. She said, quote, "I can best be supported by financial assurance that my expenses will still be covered. We've been in a high quality, award recognized center in our community for 30 years and never been in need of major financial funding other than our earned revenue. The scary place to be after 30 years of success. I've always known that hard work, perseverance, integrity, and honesty would keep us operating at our highest level, only to find out that in times like now, it isn't enough. We may lose all that we've worked for and have to close an organization that we all know the community will need when we can get back to work." And that's not just about funding, it's about all of the things that everybody on this call has talked about, but the opportunity to hear directly in their own words from the folks who are being affected, I think, is required in addition to the broader look at how communities are affected and the needs of the nonprofit organizations in them.
Great, that's very helpful, Kevin. Valerie, this is a question that I think maybe you might be very knowledgeable to kick off for us. The question is, has anyone addressed how to think about the design of our thinking and strategy development in phases? Immediate support, midterm 2020 support, and 2021 and beyond support. And I think this is sort of in the vein of listening. And I know that you've consulted with organizations around sort of their listening strategies. Do you have a sense of what a roadmap might be for funders with listening during this time, if this continues to stretch on?
Yeah, I think I think it's hard to come up with a blanket sort of roadmap, but I think there are indeed phases, and this is an immediate response moment, and I think we need to acknowledge sort of the crisis moment. But I think in principle, I guess, let me say this, a broad headline I think is just really about being adaptive, and I think others have signaled that this is a time for adaptive strategy. It's adapting how you listen, but then it's also being adaptive as a foundation in terms of your strategy development efforts, and taking in the new inputs, the new information, and pivoting and recognizing you may have to make different choices in terms of your strategy. So I do think it's about crisis moment, sort of what are kind of a triage almost moment right now in some ways. And then I think it is about planning a bit for the future. And then I think it is about seed setting, what seeds need to be planted. I think others have indicated in different ways, whether it's in advocacy, whether it's in policy work, or whether it's about sort of long-term protections, but that it needs to move from triage to then really seed setting long-term. So I don't know if those map specifically by year, but I think it is taking this phased approach to recognize that your decisions are going to evolve. And also I would just echo that you can't just listen this one time. So you're going to have to go back at various times, and things are going to be changing. People's needs are going to be changing on the ground. The context is going to be changing. And so you've got to think about, is there a way to keep a constant pulse, whether it's directly in some direct listening or relying on grantee partners to provide some of that continued indirect ways for you as a foundation to listen.
Can I just build on that for a second, Grace?
Yep,
really quickly? Because I think that we've talked so much about listening, and it would be a really weird situation if all funders did was listen, right? That's not a conversation. That's not a two-way. There's also talking that happens in between. And I think one of the things that we hear again and again from grantees in what they write about their work with funders is help set some expectations. Help set some expectations about how you want me to reach out in the in-between moments, the informal moments. And I think this is such a clear moment where funders can be setting expectations for grantees about how and when they want the proactive communication coming back in, even when grantees haven't been asked, even when funders aren't in active listening mode. But this is a continually, this is a moment for feedback loops, and that is ultimately a two-way conversation, not one that's just about listening. Although conversation where it's just talking, just as bad.
Yeah.
I would offer another, in addition to that, is the idea that this is a moment for us to rethink what's happening, because this is going to be with us for a while. There is not a clear idea of what these relationships look like. And I don't know how many folks have really been happy with the way things have developed, and there's a lot of work to try to reimagine what these relationships can look like between those with resources and power and privilege and those that are really vulnerable and set aside. And this is an opportunity for us not just to step back, wait for things to kind of calm down, and then we'll go back to normal, because normal wasn't good enough. Normal has left a lot of folks really vulnerable. And the opportunity for us to step back and rethink, how are we bringing those voices into these boardrooms? How are we in regular relationship with those that are touching so many of the folks that are really vulnerable? And for us to be really honest, because the fatigue that we're feeling as organizations is setting in, and we are already running so thin and inequitably before, the opportunity for this to be exacerbating the problems that we had before can only get worse unless we're reimagining and envisioning together, what do we want that to be? So the expectation setting is great, but are you asking more of what expectations we have of you as institutions? That dialogue needs to not just go on the back burner now, and it has every opportunity to be on the back burner because we're afraid of pissing you off. But how do we go deeper with that?
Yes, and actually that dovetails so well with our time is almost to an end, and I think we could keep talking about this. It's been a really rich conversation. Pancho, you kind of kicked us off with this final question really well, and that is, if we were to successfully leverage this moment to create a new normal, as you mentioned, for philanthropy related to feedback and really centering the voices of those who are typically least heard, what specifically do each of you want that to look like? And I would ask that we kind of have a pithy response here, but I think that would be a great place for us to end, is what would the new normal look like if we could design it? Pancho, I'll let you start. Would you like to add anything from what you just shared?
I think it's important for you to be resourcing that work in terms of being in authentic relationship with people and having difficult conversations about power and about especially about equity, and talking about how race plays out in all of our systems. So having those difficult conversations and resourcing it and saying we need to set aside the time and energy to be able to do so, and we're going to be vulnerable in our spaces and places. So I think it's critical.
Great. Dennis, would you go next?
Sure. I think the title grantee is the hat that nonprofits wear that is not the one that defines them when they're doing their work. They don't think of themselves as grantees first. They think of themselves as leaders in the world doing the work that we all need them to do. Given that, I think my hope is that philanthropy will engage with nonprofits and communities as trusted partners and co-creators from the start, and dispense with a more transactional way of interacting with grant partners forever.
Great. Kevin?
I think this moment has called on funders and nonprofits to be incredibly flexible. That would not be the watchword of the foundation grantee relationship before this crisis happened. So I hope that the more flexible approach that we're all experimenting with right now sticks.
Faye?
Yeah, I would say in this moment of emergency, listening in different ways with sensitivity and engaging with our grantee partners all across the world who are working on different things is critical. And as we move into reconstruction, sort of after the major crisis and into reconstruction and renewal, that we do have new norms of listening, both to the leaders that Dennis was talking about and also to the people and communities that we're ultimately seeking to help with our funding. And I'll take a 10-second opportunity to plug the fact that the Fund for Shared Insight is going to be making another round of grants available this summer to do listening through Listen for Good, which is a very simple tool that Valerie described, and we're opening that up for applications in July. And the idea is to get into a new normal, a new rhythm of simple listening, considering, being sensitive to, responding to the needs, preferences, insights of people and communities, and making sure that those insights not only find their way into the consideration of nonprofits, but also funders.
Great, thank you, Faye. And Valerie?
Yeah, I think I guess I'd focus on foundations. I think this is a moment for foundations we talk about listening sometimes also as a technical exercise, but it's actually what I love about listening, and sort of when you begin it technically, it actually really has significant ripple effects and leads to cultural change in an institution. And so I think this is an opportunity to embark on that, but really think about the ripple effects that can come from listening, and to all the points that people have made, change how you do business as a funder, change how you exist in relationship with those that you serve, and move into sort of authentic and open engagement and deeper engagement with the communities and the people that you're actually seeking to help long term.
Great. I wanted to say a huge thank you to each of you on the panel. This has been a really great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and for all the attendees. We hope you'll check out the pledge if you haven't already yet, and these resources from COF. And a huge thank you again to the council for making this webinar possible. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Grace. Bye, everyone.